All right, hello everybody. This is Johnny Vasquez, and I want to welcome you to this Yarncraft Academy lecture. It's called How to Sell Your Patterns, Part 1, which means, yes, there will be at least a Part 2, and depending on how many questions you guys have, maybe a Part 3. But in this class, we're going to go over a few different things. We will cover what elements do you need to publish a pattern. How do you give your pattern a name that doesn't suck? The one thing that you need to have in your pattern photos so that it will sell. How to write a bio that isn't boring. And crafting a final page that sells more of your work. So, why are we doing this lecture? Well, in November of 2017, we did a Black Friday boot camp with our hat design masterclass. And so if you were fortunate enough to attend that, you learned the basics of designing your own hat pattern. Well, there were some people that wanted to know, okay, what's the next steps? Let's say I've actually designed a hat pattern. Now what do I do? How do I go on to actually sell that and, make some money on it? And so that's what this class is about. It's really to walk you through what we do here at the Academy and at Yarn Nation when we put together a pattern. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the actual elements of the pattern. And what we do here is we start with like a text document that has our pattern written out. So we're going to be looking at a pattern that I have called Billow. And this is, I'll just show you a picture of it real quick. This is Billow. It's a crocheted hat that basically uses one stitch throughout the majority of it, but it's a lot of fun to make, and it looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. So, which is kind of the type of stuff that I like to design, stuff that looks complicated but is really easy to make. So this is Billow, and this is one of the patterns that we'll be focusing on today. So this is the pattern for Billow. This is the raw written out text for Billow, and in general, you would be writing these instructions out as you work the pattern. Usually for me, I'm not thinking that far ahead. So when I'm designing, I make it once and then I sort of reverse engineer it and then go back and write the pattern afterwards. I'm getting better at that, but basically that's what you would do. So once we have a written pattern, you want to make sure that it's in the proper format for you to be able to translate into the finished pattern. And so what we've sort of created our own guidelines, but using a pattern guideline framework from another organization is probably a good way for you to begin. So if you are making a knit pattern, then I would highly recommend checking out Knitty.com's style guide. And so this is what they use when you are submitting your pattern to them. Okay? So I'm just going to walk you through this guideline because it makes things much, much easier when you are trying to format the pattern into something else, right? And since this is just text, it can be a little bit difficult to work through. So obviously you want to have your pattern name and whoever designed it. And then it's good to include some level of difficulty. Now they use kind of like fun descriptions for their difficulty, but basically there's our easy, medium, a little bit harder and hard, right? Um, so you might say like, beginner, easy, medium, or intermediate, and advanced, right? We are shifting our difficulty scale to be more about how engaging the pattern is, as opposed to some arbitrary measure of your skill level as a crafter, because that's a subjective thing. And we can say like, okay, well, this is just a lot more involved pattern, as opposed to like, well, you're not as advanced a knitter or crocheter. And we don't really want to do that to people. So difficulty is definitely something that you can use. And if you want to just use a standard, you can go to the Craft Yarn Council, and they have a whole bunch of standards as far as types of yarn weights, and I'm trying to find the one that they have here. Yarn standards, I think, is it. They have skill levels right here. Okay, so this has skill levels, and it also has, I believe, some descriptions about what the skill levels are. So this is a recognized standard. Oh yeah, here, these are what the different skill levels mention. I don't love this standard. I don't think that it's flexible enough, in my opinion, but it's something that is used across the industry. So you would not be going wrong if you had these 4 skill levels. Also, you can download these symbols and put them into your pattern if you so choose. So before we get too far down, let's talk about pattern name, because I'm going to guess that you might not have a pattern name, just in mind, or maybe you do. But for billow, my thought was that this hat was light and airy, and that these little puff stitches that make up the hat were kind of like little pillows of air, like clouds. And so I was just trying to think of a word that would describe the feeling or the emotion that would go with wearing a hat like this. And so I thought about these clouds just sort of like billowing, or these like streams of air billowing in the wind. And it sort of rhymed with pillow, and that's what those little balls remind me of. And so that's how I came up with the word billow. Now, I try to name using one word, and the word has to kind of evoke an emotion when you see it in conjunction with the pattern. That doesn't always have to be the case. But I find that the more unique you can make that word, the better. So one of the things that we do to make sure that we have like an interesting name at the Yarncraft Academy and at Yarn Nation when we're doing patterns is we try to do Japanese words. So if we look at, this is koushi, and this is a cowl that's crocheted, and it looks kind of like a lattice. So I looked up Japanese words for lattice, and this was one of the ones that came up here, was koushi. So I thought that sounded pretty cool, and so that's how we ended up with the word koushi. And I think if you've got like a heritage or ethnic heritage that allows you to imbue meaning to something in an interesting way. So let's say that you're Norwegian. Norwegian translation. And so we want to, let's say we'll do the same thing. We'll try and find lattice. Okay. So lattice is Gitter, although I don't know how they pronounce their things. And so that's an interesting name. Maybe it doesn't evoke what you want from that. So we could look for something else. We could look for lace, blonder. So that could be a word that works well for your thing. You could be very literal, right? You could say cowl, and in Norwegian that's cowl. But here, right, its pronunciation is like kowl. So you might want to use this version here for your thing. And maybe that's for something that's very simple. It's just a very basic cowl. So you would use this different spelling to make that more interesting. But you just start trying things, okay? So that one's got like a lot of triangles in it. So let's see. That's not interesting, right? Triangle's the same thing. So you just keep playing with these ideas to try and come up with something that works, okay? So we look at this again, and we've got like a crisscross pattern. So let's look at cross. So here we got Chris. And so that could be a really interesting name for a pattern like this. And people just don't know what it means. And I like words like this that have a meaning behind them and the connection to who you are as a person better than like naming it like after a person or something like that. Like we have a whole line of sweaters that we did that were designed for our friends, and so those sweaters are named after our friends, and so that has additional meaning behind it. But if you're just naming it because you gave it to, or you're giving it to someone, and you're naming it Jamie, and there's not really anything that really describes what the sweater is, I feel like that's maybe not the best way to go. So the other thing that I would caution you away from is words that are very literally like nature-ish. So like falling leaves or running water or wood grain, stuff like that. That stuff, I think it's almost too generic. And so I think you want to try and imbue your name with maybe 2 or 3 layers of meaning if you can. So that is how I go about coming up with pattern names that don't suck. I think the best way to go about it is look for another language. Just use Google Translate. And then for some of these other languages that are more robust, like Japanese, I use a few different sites to like test words and start doing that. And then you can start doing word combinations if you need to, in order to come up with the perfect name. But ideally, you're going to have just the one name, the one word as the name, and then that's going to have all the meaning underlying in it. So if you're having a photographer do it, then it's good, obviously, to give them credit as well as the model in your pattern. And then they here recommend giving a description of the pattern, design features, inspiration, construction tips. It would be good for you to write this stuff out, even if it's for your own pattern, okay? Just so that you've got a document. And when you start writing your description for Ravelry or Etsy or your website where you're going to start selling this, it's really good to have this information down. I would even recommend creating a little survey for yourself where you're asking maybe these questions every single time. So, what inspired this pattern? Okay, so was it a stitch pattern? Was it something in nature? Was it a book or movie? Maybe it was another design, right? Maybe it was a geometric shape, or maybe it was some sort of like philosophical idea, right? Like maybe you wanted to like do an artistic representation of like the Pythagorean theorem, or I'm sorry, that's not philosophical, of the battle between good and evil, right? And so that's like what you're representing. So going back to the naming thing, right? Then you want to look at like, okay, the battle between good and evil, where is that represented mythically in history? Are there any famous wars or like Armageddon or things like that? And then, you can say, okay, well, what's Armageddon in Norwegian, right? Well, okay, it's Ragnarok, right? So then you could make your cowl pattern or your hat pattern called Ragnarok, right? Because that's where it's being represented, right, by this design. So writing out like a little paragraph about the inspiration would be really useful in describing it later. And if there is multiple levels of these things that inspired your pattern, then write a sentence or two about each of them. And then I would say once it's finished, say, what does this pattern remind me of? And so you can then take a new look at the pattern once it's finished and see, does it make you think of anything else, right? Does it make you think of like whirlpools or let's say a pond, or let's say it makes you think of moss on a tree. Okay, it doesn't really matter what it is, but you just want to start like pulling these ideas together, getting them on paper so that you can use that information later to write your copy to describe the pattern. And you don't have to write a ton of copy to describe your pattern, but the design is going to have some sort of a story, and you want to document the story, okay? Document the story. That's important. All right. So those are just a few questions to keep in mind as you're preparing. And then, of course, you want to list any special techniques. So if you are doing like a bobble stitch, right? Not everybody knows what a bobble stitch is. And so you're going to want to describe that technique specifically. Maybe you make something up, right? Like you have to do something in the pattern that you've maybe not seen before. So you're going to come up with an abbreviation. So you're going to want to include all of your abbreviations. Now, in Nitty, they actually have a standard set of abbreviations that you would use. All right, so let's come back here. We've got our sizes. Okay, so if the pattern is going to come in multiple sizes, this is a good format to use here. And then, so like for accessories, they just have small, medium, large, etc. and then the finished measurements of the actual piece. So for the hat, you would want the length, right, and probably the circumference of the hat, not necessarily just the width of it. For a scarf, you could have just length and width, and then you might want to like give like a size range if you were doing like socks. What size is it going to fit? But it is important for things that need to fit a person. It's important to have finished measurements because that's how the person can tell if their pattern is actually going to fit. All right, next you're going to want to get into your materials. It's good to include the manufacturer's name, the fiber content, and they suggest particularly using yards and meters per ounce or gram. So yards per ounce are meters per gram, depending on what the yarn lists. And then also the color that you used for your sample. And then obviously the number of skeins that you used based on each size. So if you're doing like a sweater, you might need to add a couple of skeins of yarn the bigger the sweater is. If you're using multiple colors of the same yarn, then you would list the additional colors, and if it's the main color, contrasting color, etc. And then for some reason, if you used 2 yarns from different brands, then obviously you'd want to include this here. I would suggest not doing that because the company that you use may be more likely to promote your pattern if you're just using all of their yarn. So if you're going to use different yarns, I would suggest using them from the same manufacturer. All right, you're going to want to include the suggested needle size that you use, and or hook, depending on what it is. And then it's important to include that in both the US measurements and millimeters. That's because millimeters are not always consistent across manufacturers. I'm sorry, the US measurements are not always consistent across manufacturers. Most of the time they are, but every once in a while they're a little bit different, particularly at the big craft stores. And then you want to let them know if they're using circular needles or flat needles. And then any notions that they might need. Are they going to need stitch markers? Are they going to need a stitch holder? Are they going to need cable needles, buttons, etc.? Finally, you want to measure your gauge and give that in stitches and rows or rounds, if you're doing it in the round, per 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And they recommend it in stockinette stitch and in pattern stitch. So I usually only include the pattern stitch, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to include both. I would say you definitely want to include it in the pattern stitch. It's really up to you if you include it in stockinette or maybe single crochet. Okay, and then if you have specific stitches that you're using, like I mentioned before, or notes on the pattern, you'll want to include that, and then any charts. So we can talk a little bit about charting software at the end if you need to use charts. But it's always a nice thing to include a chart if you can, and the pattern will benefit from it. So say if you're using lace or cables, then it would be a good idea to have a chart in there of your pattern repeat. So then you're just going to write out your pattern. And I'm not going to talk too deeply about here. Just that one of the things I do like about Knitty's style guide is that you don't want to include your instructions in a conversational or chatty tone. They need to be detailed and explicit instructions, but concise. You don't want them to be too wordy. And and you don't want to make generalizations. So you don't want to assume that your customer, the person making the pattern, knows more than they actually do. So you should err on the side of more detail than less detail. So here they talk about, don't say like decrease evenly across so many stitches, because that's not particularly easy to do if you've never done it before. Okay, and then you all want to include a bio and your headshot. Now this is for submission to them, but it's a good idea for you to have as well, and we'll talk about creating a bio in a little bit. So we've talked about all of those elements that go into a pattern. Let's take a look at an actual pattern and how we've translated all of that stuff into the finished piece. So this is the actual billow template that we use here. And this is, we use a template for designing our patterns. So our patterns always have a cover page with a big photo in the front. We do the title of the pattern and then who the designer is right here. Okay. And then here is the first page for the pattern. So it looks like this formatting got a little bit messed up here, but that's okay. It's easy to fix. I think they updated this, so that's why. So let's take a look at this. So we've got our skill level. Okay, we use a 5-point skill level, and this would be easy. Beginner is our first level. Okay. Size, we have one size fits most. So we didn't particularly say, oh, this is a large or a medium. There's just one size to this pattern. This used 2 skeins of Pacifica Yarn Company Zephyr DK, which is 55% wool, 45% cotton. And you would want to include the yardage. The yardage for this is 130 yards per 50 grams. Whoops. Yards per 50 grams. Okay. Gauge for this, it says it's not important because basically you're like making the hat based off of measurements on this one, and so that's why we didn't include gauge. And then for this, you're using an H8 hook. That's a 5mm hook, and then you need a tapestry or darning needle for weaving in the ends. So here are the stitches that are used in this: chain stitch, slip stitch, single crochet, back loop, single crochet, and then the puff stitch. And here I include the instructions on how to do the puff stitch. So you can include that here, or you can include it in kind of like an appendix at the back if you'd like. It doesn't really matter. It's entirely up to you. And then here we have the instructions. So we're going through all of the instructions. And you want to have at least a 1/2 inch of room on all sides. If not more, I would say 1 inch is probably even better. And so here you can see that we've taken these instructions, which are all just text, and we've given it some additional formatting. So we've just made things easier to identify. So this section is the hat body. Okay. This print, it's very big. I think this is a size 16 font. Okay. So it's a lot easier to read. Now, we don't need to do things in 12-point font anymore because this is going to be a PDF. So you can have as many pages as you want of text, and it's really not going to take up that much more information. It's not going to be that much bigger a file. So that's why we use a bigger font in ours. So the important thing here is to make sure that anything that you need to stand out, make sure that you're making visual cues for people to pay attention to it. This is a note, right? You want to make sure that you have an even number of stitches before moving to the next row. Okay. And then each section here, we've just highlighted this is what you need to do. This is actually a really short pattern, so there's not a lot to it. The whole body is all these 2 rows. And then there's the decreasing. So in the shaping here, there's a little bit more, but it's only because just small pieces are changing, right? It's going from 4 puff stitches to 3 puff stitches to 2 puff stitches to 1. Okay. And so, you have to be specific about each of those things in the pattern. And then we just have some basic information on how to finish the pattern. And then like the Brooklyn tweed patterns, they include some information on blocking. So if you wanted to do something like that as well, that would be helpful. Now, the other thing that I want to point out in this pattern is that we use a lot of photos, okay? They're not huge photos. We have our cover, and then we just try and throw little detail photos in throughout the pattern, okay? Wherever it makes sense. So let's talk about photography for a minute, because this is probably the most important factor of your pattern. Okay, is the photography. This is really what's going to sell it. So when we shoot, our ideal situation is to shoot a few patterns with a couple models at once so that we can get a bunch of stuff done at one time. So during this shoot, we actually did, I want to say probably like 10 different patterns. And we had 2 models. So this is Natalie. She went to the church that we were going to at that time, and we just said, hey, do you want to come and model? And I think we paid her like $50 to come and model. And for us, that made a lot of sense because, we were going to have her model quite a few things. And, it was a few hours out of her day, but, she, rather than just sitting at home watching Netflix, got to make $50. So, but what I want to point out here is that we took a ton of photos for this one pattern, and we really only ended up using 4, right? 4 or 5 of those photos. So I'm just going to walk you through all the photos that we took, and you can see that they're really not even that much different. We're just changing the exposure a little bit. Now, we did have a photographer who was familiar with a camera, but she was not a professional photographer. I think she shot everything for us for like $200 for the whole day. And you don't have to spend a ton of money to do this. You can find people at your church, at your knitting group, at school. Just ask a friend to come and model and be like, hey, I'll buy you lunch. And if you don't know how to use a camera, ask someone that does, someone that you know. Say, hey, is there anything that I can trade? Is there something that I can do? But the important thing is that you need to use a decent camera. And a decent camera can even be your iPhone with the right lighting. I've taken photos for patterns with my iPhone. But you don't have to have a $10,000 camera to get good photos, okay? But it would be good to work with someone that has a DSLR, that has the interchangeable lenses, and that has a little bit of an idea of how to adjust the settings on the camera to control the light. That sounds intimidating, but it doesn't have to be. You could go to like the local community college and say, hey, they're always looking for projects to do. You can just say, hey, you could hire them for a little bit of money so that they can get the experience, or maybe they've got a project that they need to do for class and they'd be happy to take the photos for free. And their models are always looking for photos to add to their portfolio, especially when they're starting out. So you can put an ad out on Craigslist or something like that, and just be very specific, like, hey, we're looking for someone to model some knitwear. It pays $50 or whatever for the day, and be very clear that you're not like a sleazy old man that's looking to get them to take photos half naked, because there's a lot of ads like that on Craigslist. But work with your network first. I'm sure that you have someone in your network that's got a daughter in high school or college or something like that would be happy to take some photos. So, and why go to all this effort? It's because the hat looks better on a person than it would just on the ground or on the floor or on a table. So think about how much more you're connecting with the person that's in this photo as much as you are the hat on her, right? Like, she's happy. She looks like she's enjoying, like her life is improved by wearing this hat. And if you contrast that with the hat I didn't have done in time to have it on a person, so this is still a nice hat, this Santiago hat, right? But it doesn't give you, and there's no emotion here. There's nothing that says like, oh, I want to be that person wearing that thing. And so that's why it's really important for you to have it on a person. Even on a mannequin, I would say, is not good. In fact, it's maybe even worse than just putting it on a table, because it's definitely fake. It's definitely not, someone to connect with. It looks and it feels fake. It feels cheap. So I would say put it on a cool background if you have to, but definitely if you can, you want to get it photographed on a person. Okay, so coming back to the photos, I just want to walk you through the different photos that we have here, and you can see how many we actually took. We just tried different angles. Sometimes these photos look like they're the same, but they're taken sort of like seconds apart, so they are just slightly different. Taken from different distances, so we have more of the background in some of these. Taken at different orientations, so here we've got a lot more headroom. And these were mostly just choices that the photographer made, so there wasn't necessarily a lot that I was directing as far as, it needs to look like this. More, we wanted to get the hat at lots of different angles. And it's better to have more options than not enough. And so, you'll look at someone's photography and be like, wow, those are amazing photos. But, the reality is that they probably took 100 photos to get that one photo that looks really great. And so that's sort of what you're looking for, is you're looking for that perfect combination of, light. So you can see these three photos here are similar, but there's more sunlight coming through in each one, and it's illuminating her face a little bit differently. Here she's smiling with her teeth. Here she's not. Here she's looking off to the side. Here she's looking right at the camera. And each one of these things gives you like a different emotional connection to the person. It's not even anything that grand. It's more just a hint of a feeling, right? And you definitely connect more with the person when you're looking them in the eyes than when you're not. So just think about what these two different photos, or even these three photos that you can see on screen right now, what do those evoke in you? And that's going to help determine what photo you choose to represent the pattern. Even in between these two pictures here, there's just kind of like a little bit more life in her eyes in this photo. And I probably wouldn't use a photo like this because it doesn't show enough of the hat. So this is one of the photos that we ended up using for the main picture. Let's see. We're almost done with these. You can see here's more of a detail picture of the back of the hat. There you can see the top of it really well. And then just more straight on, like here's what you would look like if you were wearing the hat and we were talking to each other. All right, so the one that got chosen for the cover was this one. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? It's because I kind of like the way that her hair looks that as it's falling. You can see enough of the hat to get an idea of how it's going to lay on the person's head. She's smiling, so she looks happy. Her shirt offers some color, which is nice. And and she's got a smile in her eyes as well. She's looking off screen, which is not quite as striking as if she was looking directly at the camera, but some people actually find that intimidating. So this is, it's someone that looks like they're enjoying life, they're having a good time, they're happy, and they've got my pattern on her head. And what we're trying to go for is, I want to be this person, right? Whatever life she's living, I want to live that. And perhaps I can do that more easily if I have this hat that I've made that looks like the one in the picture. And that seems like a little silly, but it's really kind of how we make decisions about things. So the other photos that are included in the pattern are primarily there to just reinforce what's going on in the pattern, right? That this is a side view, so you get a better idea of like, here's what my head's going to look like if I'm wearing the pattern. And then if we go over to, let's see, to the actual pattern template, this one, she's looking at the camera. We chose that one because it's more emotional connection with the audience. Here's the side view. Here's the detail view, right? So we chose each of these specifically so that you get like a full sort of 360 view of the hat. But it's not just the hat on the ground on a cool background. In fact, we use this sort of neutral background so that there's more of a focus on the pattern itself. Now, if you could do it on, like, with a beautiful background, at a park or something like that, I would just say that the less distracting the background, the better, because the emphasis is going to be much more on the pattern. You don't need to do a minimalist thing like we did here. This was an aesthetic that we prefer. We have these like sharp lines and these, more modern design elements that are very minimal And if you want to do something with more flourish, that's fine. That if that's indicative of your personality and the brand that you're trying to create with your work, go for it. The important thing really is that you want to have consistency in the look of your brand as you're developing your patterns. So when you're making a pattern, you want it to be instantly recognizable as yours. And maybe that's probably a drawback of ours, is that it looks a little bit too much like some other brands that are out there. That's probably just because we have similar aesthetics choices that we like. And then it's really about making the pattern clear. So if people are able to easily follow the pattern and find the information that they're looking for, then it's going to be, they're going to enjoy making the pattern more, right? You don't want to frustrate them trying to figure out, what do I need to do next, or how do I do the thing that I'm trying to do? Okay, so we've talked about naming patterns. We've talked about the elements that you need in the pattern. We've talked about photography. Let's talk about this next part, which is so that one thing that you need to have in your patterns, so that the photos in your pattern photos, so that it will sell, is a human being. So let's talk a little bit about writing a bio and the last page of your pattern. And I want to show you a pattern here that we did for 30-day sweater. That is the Henley sweater framework. I'm just going to pull this up real quick. So completely different look to this pattern. And I just redesigned this pattern not that long ago, actually. So I'm going to, there we go. So nice big picture up front. The title's bold. This is part of like a series of patterns, so that's why we have this here. We've got a branding element in the corner and the designer. And then this is sort of like a little introductory note from the designer, which is my wife, Lacey. And this one has a lot more photos. So you can see we have a lot of detail photos in this one. This is also a much longer pattern, so that's why. But the information is very easy to see what it is that you need. And then this one actually has some diagrams in it because there's sort of a unique way of creating the collar in this pattern. So we played with a few different design elements in this one, but what I really want to show you is the end here, and that's about the designer. So Lacey Lene is a model and knitwear designer you may have seen on the cover of Knit Scene. Her modeling career has taken her all over the world, including New York, Brazil, and China. She currently works as the in-house knitwear designer for the Yarncraft Academy. She travels the world full-time with her husband and 2 daughters. So this bio actually has a very specific structure to it, and you might not think that just by reading it. But this is more a general, here's why you should care about Lacey, as far as like cool things that like credentially type things, right? So this is all social proof stuff that we're trying to identify here. She has some legitimacy because she's worked as a model. She does knitwear design, and you've seen her on the cover of a magazine that you're probably familiar with. And even if you haven't seen her on the cover, you would be impressed by the fact that that's the case. Next, we talk about some cool fact about the something that she's done, right? So she has done a bunch of traveling as a result of modeling, right? Then we talk about what she's currently doing with her life or with her work. So kind of like what she's working on or what she does that's important. And that's part of the reason for this, is to show like, okay, she is continuing to work in the industry, but also to identify like another place that you can find her stuff. And then the last is a more, here's what she's up to, but personal. So let's I'm going to walk you through this framework and how to like do it yourself. So I'm just going to get rid of this real quick. And actually, we'll create a new one. Okay. So the framework is legitimacy. Okay, and that is, I spelled that wrong. This is all about credentials, like important stuff you've done. And we really want to focus on creating authority. So let's say that you don't have any authority, right? Let's say that you're just, not just, but let's say that you're, this is like a side thing for you and you're, a stay-at-home mom most of the time. That's fine. We want to look at like something that we can come up with that sounds like it's important. If you don't have anything that's actually important, right? So let's say, a way to establish authority is time spent, right? So we can say that like Jennifer has been knitting for 15 years and has created many unique designs during that time. So you could finesse this and make it, a little bit more concise. But what we're really going for here is the fact that like you've spent a lot of time knitting, and most people will look at that and be like, oh wow. And even if it's not even a ton of time, even if it's 5 years or it's you might not think 5 years is a long time, but 5 years is a long time. Someone is just starting out. So don't discredit that because you think it's not long enough. There's also people that have been knitting for 25 years and have only done scarves. So they'll still think that, oh, this person knows what they're doing. And we're not trying to like swindle anybody. We're not trying to like bloat the truth. We're just trying to like establish where your authority is in their mind. So what is it that you can put on paper that says you should listen to me, right? And if you don't feel like you have anything, like there's always something that you bring to the table that's unique. It doesn't have to be, an award. It doesn't have to be, so like for Lacey, she's designs knitwear or has designed knitwear, but that's not really her main occupation, and neither is modeling, right? But she's done both of those things. So they're not lies, they are truth. But when you say like, oh, I've been a model, they go, oh, okay, well then she must know something about design or something. And that's not necessarily true either, because was a hair model. So she didn't do very much in the fashion side of things at all. But and the hair modeling thing is less than part-time for her. She does it a few times a year for a weekend at a time. But she has had all of these great experiences as a result of modeling. So she did go to China and to Brazil and things like that as a result of doing some modeling on the side. Which brings us to the next thing, which is an interesting fact. Okay? And so this is where you're trying to you're sort of like building the legend, right? And so this is where I like to add my 2 truths and a lie thing. Only you would use like one of your 2 best truths. So there's a game called 2 truths and a lie, and basically you tell like 3 interesting facts about yourself, but one of them is not true. So for me, like I would say, I've had dinner with Tom Cruise. I've danced with Brazilian clowns, and I've played basketball with Buddhist monks. Okay? And the lie there is that I've not had dinner with Tom Cruise, but I did sit at Tom Cruise's table at an award show. I didn't get to talk to him, but so that there's truth in that lie, but that's not the important thing. These stories, right, they're kind of like fantastical. They're like almost too good to be true. And if you want to know about the Brazilian clowns and the Buddhist monks, you can ask me sometime. But you were looking for some sort of cool story like that. Like I paid for a taxi in New York City with a pack of gum once, right? It's a true story. But it's really just supposed to like help show your personality and the types of things that you've done with your life, because people don't know really, they don't really know you, and you're giving them 4 sentences to try and like get a window into who you are. But we want it to be more interesting than like, Jennifer lives in Milwaukee, and with her 2 dogs and pet goldfish. Like that's not compelling. And so an interesting fact like this helps. So we'll say this, right? She wants, let's say, performed for the Queen of England, or let's say we'll say this, she's an accomplished singer who once performed for the Queen of England, right? Here we go. It's just another piece of information that's different, but creates more interest in who you are. All right, so then you want to talk about what you're doing. We say like, currently, she's working on a collection of children's sweater, and then you'll do the generic thing. She lives in Milwaukee with her pet chihuahuas, Ben and Stein, and her goldfish sushi. Right? So we're adding a little bit of life into that by giving the animals names, right? So this format here, which is what are you working on next? And then I call this kind of like family life, right? So you put a sentence about your family life. So these are the 4 sort of things that I like to include in a bio that make it compelling and interesting. All right. So you want something that establishes authority. You want some sort of interesting fact about things that you've done in the past. And again, they don't need to be related. It's probably better if they're not related to knitting. What you're working on next. So if it's a new pattern or a collection or a book or stuff like that, like that's what we want. Or you could say like she blogs at blah, 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 right? Like you're really trying to highlight, get them like interested in the other thing that you're doing in the space. And then the family life is just more to give people an idea that like, you know, you're a person with an active life and responsibilities above and beyond your work as a designer, right? Because a lot of designers are working part-time, it's not their full-time gig. I'd say probably most are not making their money full-time from designing. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is your final page. And for that, what I want to do is take a look at Sidewinder. So this is a free pattern that I put out a while back, a long time ago. It's 5 years ago now. Okay? And so this is a strategy that I like to use is I create a free pattern, okay, that is one size and pretty simple, pretty basic. Like there's not a lot to it. So this has actually really simple. It's just garter stitch, and then it's shaped with short rows on the top. So you can see it's how it's shaped right here. But so that's the whole pattern. This page is basically the entire pattern. But what I've done is I have a additional version of the pattern, right, that I call Sidewinder Plus, and that version has 3 different sizes. It actually gives you multicolored versions of the hat. There's some video tutorials in that, and then I give you like a 1-page or 2-page printable version. Whereas this one, I think the plus version is like 14 pages. It's more like a mini magazine. And so, I've got my bio and stuff here and the credits for the pattern. But it's this page here that you could do a lot with, right? Including a page like this in your pattern allows you to promote something else. So maybe it's a book that you're doing, or maybe it's a collection of patterns, And if you're interested in getting into design, you should think of yourself like a musician, like an indie musician who makes their living by creating music and albums and then performing throughout, the country or the world. So look at a pattern like this as like a single, okay? And it's part of a bigger thing. And so that's where I like to design patterns in like mini collections. So you might have this pattern, and then you've got a more in-depth version of this pattern, and maybe you've got another version of the pattern that's a little bit different. So with Sidewinder, we actually have another one in our shaping class. Where is that? Knitting. we go, shaping. So we have the aviator version, right? And these are all based off of the same basic template, but they are different hats in and of themselves, and so they have, each of them has value. But you put them all together, and now you've got a little collection, right? You've got 3 different hats. You've got a beanie, a slouchy beanie that's striped, and you've got the aviator hat. So as soon as you've got 3 or 4 patterns, like that's basically a little collection, and you can promote that as a bigger thing. You can bundle it, you can sell it for a little bit more money, and you can get people to upgrade and say, okay, well, maybe you got this little one to begin with, but or this free one to begin with, but you want to buy this other mini collection that's got all of these other things. They don't have to be, the same thing. They could just be inspired by the same design motif or, something similar. I think actually I have another pattern here from Lacey. Let's see. This is, what did we call it? Bernadette. So in the Bernadette pattern, I'm pretty sure we included some, like a couple of things at the end here. Yeah, so here's some other patterns by Lacey, right, that she did. And so these are just, they're basically ads for other patterns. And I just don't see this being done enough in people's patterns. But, you could think of this as like if you ever watch a YouTube video and it shows like related videos and you're like, oh, well, I'd like to watch more things by that person. This is the same thing, right? Like you're probably going to be interested in more patterns by that person. And so just including a page that shows the stuff that you've done, is a great way to advertise to someone who's already interested in your work, someone who's probably already paid for your work. So once you formatted your pattern and stuff, then you're ready to start building out your pages to sell the stuff. And in the next session of this lecture, we'll go over how to set up your Ravelry page, how to set up Etsy, and we might even talk about selling it on your own website so you don't have to be in those marketplaces if you don't want. Although I'd say that being in those marketplaces is probably a good idea. But I hope that you guys learned a lot from this. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments on this page, and I will address them, and I'll definitely be including responses to those in another session down the road. So maybe what we'll do is we'll take the questions from this one and the questions from the next one, and then we'll answer those during one of our Q&As. So thank you so much for joining us for this lecture, and I hope to see you next time.